Poor black teen saves little boy, then discovers he's the mayor's son. Epic story moments. It was just another ordinary day in the heart of a struggling neighborhood, until a single act of courage changed everything. Jalen, a poor black teenager with dreams bigger than his circumstances, was walking home when he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A little boy, no more than 8, was standing on the edge of a busy street, unaware of the speeding car barreling towards him. Without thinking, Jalen rushed forward, grabbing the boy just in time, pulling him out of harm's way. But what Jalen didn't know was that this boy, the one he'd saved from a near-death experience, wasn't just any child. He was the son of someone with the power to change Jalen's life forever. Jalen's neighborhood was a place where hope was a rare commodity. The streets were cracked, the houses crumbling from years of neglect. The air smelled of worn asphalt, oil, and something else, something heavier. It was the smell of unspoken promises, dreams deferred, and lives on hold. Here, most kids never made it past 18 without a hard lesson in survival. But Jalen, a 17-year-old black teenager, had always felt like he was meant for something bigger than the life he was living. Every day was a battle. It wasn't just the gangs on the corner or the police sirens that screamed through the air at night. It was the constant, grinding pressure of poverty that weighed on him, the kind that made even the smallest dream feel impossible. Jalen lived with his mother, who worked double shifts at a local diner, scraping together just enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. He knew his mom tried her best, but there was only so much one person could do. Despite the hardships, Jalen had a quiet strength about him. He wasn't the type to show it off or boast about it. But if you looked closely, you could see it. His calm demeanor in the face of adversity, the way he always tried to help others, even when he had nothing to give. That was Jalen's nature, kind-hearted, selfless, and undeniably brave. He wasn't the biggest kid in his school or the fastest, but there was a fire in him that others often overlooked. The kind of fire that kept him going when everyone else had given up. His friends, what few he had, would sometimes joke about his quiet toughness. "You ain't afraid of anything, are you?" they tease, laughing it off like it was nothing. But for Jalen, it wasn't about fearlessness. It was about doing what had to be done, even when the odds were stacked against you. Jalen knew that every choice he made, every step he took, mattered. His future wasn't something he could afford to take lightly. He dreamed of a life far beyond this place, a life where he didn't have to worry about making ends meet, where he could live without constantly being reminded of the color of his skin and the weight of his family's past. But dreams felt like luxuries here, things that could slip through your fingers if you weren't careful. And for Jalen, who had watched too many of his friends fall victim to the cycle of violence, crime, and hopelessness, the dream of a better life seemed like something that would always be just out of reach. But as he walked home from the corner store one afternoon, something happened that would change everything. Something that would force him to confront not only the reality of his world but also the possibility of a future he never imagined. The day was hot, the pavement shimmering under the summer sun, when he saw him, the little boy, standing at the edge of the street. Jalen slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing in concern. The boy couldn't have been older than 8 or 9, and he was standing alone on the curb, staring blankly at the busy traffic. Jalen's heart skipped a beat as he saw a car speeding toward the boy, the driver clearly not slowing down. Time seemed to stretch in that moment. Without thinking, Jalen sprinted forward, his legs moving before his brain could catch up. He didn't have time to wonder why the boy was out there alone. He didn't have time to think about the consequences. All he knew was that the boy was in danger, and Jalen wasn't going to let anything happen to him. With a swift motion, Jalen grabbed the boy, pulling him out of the street just as the car whizzed by, its tires screeching in protest. The boy, who had been frozen in fear, was now trembling in his arms, but alive. Jalen set him down gently on the sidewalk, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The boy's wide eyes stared up at him, still in shock, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. "You okay?" Jalen asked, his voice soft. The boy nodded, his lips trembling. "Thank you," he stammered. Jalen didn't know what to say. He didn't need to say anything. The moment was enough. He had done something that felt bigger than him. But as the boy looked up at him with gratitude, Jalen had no idea that this small act of bravery would turn his world upside down. Jalen had been walking home from the corner store, the hot summer air sticking to his skin, when he saw him. The boy was standing at the edge of the street, his small frame barely visible above the crowd of people passing by. His clothes were neat but not quite right for the neighborhood. A clean white t-shirt, denim shorts, and brand new sneakers that stood out against the dirty concrete. His head was tilted upward, eyes fixed on the busy traffic, his hands hanging loosely at his sides as if he were unaware of the danger that loomed just steps away. At first, Jalen thought the kid was just lost, maybe waiting for a parent to come pick him up. But then he saw the car. It wasn't just any car. It was speeding, its engine roaring as it came barreling down the road, weaving between other vehicles, its driver oblivious to the boy standing right in his path. Time seemed to slow, and Jalen's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't tell if the boy was frozen in place or if he simply didn't see the oncoming car. But it didn't matter. In that split second, Jalen knew what he had to do. Without thinking, he pushed himself forward, his body moving before his brain could catch up. Every instinct told him to act. His legs were already in motion, and there was no turning back now. He was running, faster than he had ever run in his life, toward the boy, who was still standing there, blissfully unaware of the speeding vehicle that would hit him in seconds. The world around him seemed to disappear. There was only the boy and the car closing in. Jalen's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he closed the gap between them. He could hear the screech of tires as the driver tried to slam on the brakes, but it was too late. The car was too close, too fast. In a final burst of energy, Jalen reached the boy and tackled him to the ground just as the car sped by them, its horn blaring and tires squealing against the asphalt. The force of the impact sent them both skidding across the rough pavement, and Jalen felt the sting of gravel against his skin as they tumbled. But it didn't matter. He had saved the boy. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and adrenaline. Jalen's heart was racing as he rolled off the boy and pushed himself up to his knees. He had no idea how badly he was hurt, only that the boy was okay. That was all that mattered. For a moment, everything was still. The world around him seemed to fade as he looked down at the boy, who was now sitting on the ground, his knees pulled up to his chest, eyes wide with shock. The boy wasn't crying, but his face was pale, and he was trembling, his tiny hands shaking as they clutched the fabric of his shorts. Jalen could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the realization of just how close they had come to disaster sinking in. He reached down and gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, but the words wouldn't come. His own heart was still racing, and all he could hear was the rush of blood in his ears, the sound of his pulse drumming in his head. "Are you okay?" Jalen finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy didn't answer at first. He just stared at him, as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. Jalen's chest tightened. He couldn't imagine what was going through the boy's mind. How could a child that young even understand the danger they had just narrowly escaped? The boy blinked, as if coming out of a daze, and then slowly nodded. I think so." His voice was shaky, but he was still alive. Jalen let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He was trembling, his body still charged with adrenaline, and he wiped his brow with the back of his hand. The boy seemed to be all right, but Jalen didn't trust his own shaky hands to check him over. Instead, he stood up and helped the boy to his feet. "Thanks," the boy whispered again, his voice small but filled with gratitude. Jalen didn't know what to say. It wasn't like he had done anything special. It was just instinct, pure, unfiltered instinct. It was what anyone would have done in his place. Right? "Don't mention it," Jalen said gruffly, trying to downplay the situation. He took a step back, glancing over his shoulder at the car that had nearly hit them. The driver was still speeding down the road, oblivious to the fact that his carelessness had nearly resulted in disaster. Jalen's eyes narrowed, but he didn't let his anger show. There was no point in chasing after a stranger who didn't even know the meaning of responsibility. But as he turned back to the boy, something caught his attention. There was a woman approaching them now, fast, her high heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk as she came closer. She was well-dressed, wearing a fitted dress that seemed out of place in a neighborhood like this. Her face was set in an expression of panic and concern, but the moment she saw her son, her features softened, and she let out a small gasp of relief. "Oh my God, Timmy! Are you all right?" she cried, rushing toward the boy, her arms outstretched. Timmy didn't say anything. He just collapsed into her arms, his body still trembling from the shock. The woman looked over her shoulder at Jalen, her eyes scanning him with a sudden intensity. "Who are you?" she asked sharply, her voice now hard, almost formal. Jalen froze, not sure how to respond. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. He wasn't used to being asked about himself by someone who looked like she had everything. He didn't know if she was mad at him for some reason or if she just didn't know how to process what had just happened. But there was no time to think about it. He wasn't looking for thanks or recognition. He just wanted to make sure the kid was okay. I just saw him in trouble," Jalen said, his voice defensive, his hands shoved in his pockets. "I didn't want anything. Just glad he's all right." The woman narrowed her eyes, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than he was comfortable with. Her eyes seemed to take in his worn clothes, his sneakers that had seen better days, and the roughness of his hands. It was clear she was sizing him up, probably wondering why he, of all people, had been the one to save her son. Then, as if coming to some conclusion, she finally spoke. "Well, thank you," she said, her tone softer now, though there was still an edge to it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek, expensive-looking business card. "If you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out." Jalen stared at the card for a long moment, feeling both confused and a little uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people offering him things, especially not people like her. What would someone like her want with someone like him? Before he could respond, the woman gently pulled Timmy away, wrapping her arms around him once more. "We're going home now, sweetheart," she murmured, soothing him, though her eyes never left Jalen. Jalen turned to leave, his mind still spinning. He hadn't expected any of this. He just acted without thinking, like he always did. But something about the situation felt off. There was more to this than just saving a kid's life. He could feel it in the air. Jalen watched as the woman, who was now gently holding her son close, glanced over at him one last time before guiding Timmy away. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He had saved the boy, that was clear, but now things were starting to feel strange. There was something about the whole encounter that didn't sit right with him. Timmy, though young, had been shaken to the core. His eyes were wide, filled with a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. But there was something else, too, a kind of distance in the boy's demeanor, as if the entire event were a brief, surreal moment in his otherwise ordered life. Jalen had seen kids act like that before, kids who didn't really know what it was like to struggle, to fight for every little thing. Timmy didn't seem to know what it meant to be truly scared, to feel the weight of survival pressing down on you every day. As the woman and Timmy moved further down the street, Jalen's eyes narrowed. The more he thought about it, the more out of place Timmy seemed. That clean, crisp white shirt. The brand new sneakers that hadn't been worn in the grime of the neighborhood streets. Jalen could tell, just by looking at him, that Timmy didn't belong here, not in this part of town. Jalen had lived here all his life, and he knew people who were doing well, but nobody walked around here looking that polished. His suspicions grew stronger when he noticed the phone. Timmy had dropped it when he was being pulled out of harm's way, but it was hard to miss. The phone looked expensive, too expensive for a kid in this neighborhood, let alone someone that young. It was one of those sleek models, one of those top-tier brands that Jalen had only ever seen in advertisements or in the hands of people who clearly had more money than most people could imagine. Even the way Timmy's mother had spoken to him felt off, so controlled, so formal, like she was trying to keep things in order, as if this brief interaction were just a small disturbance in their otherwise perfect lives. "Timmy, are you all right?" The woman was still whispering to her son, her voice low but full of concern. She stroked his hair, but there was no panic, no overwhelming worry. Just control. Jalen felt an odd pull in his chest. This boy, this child, was far removed from the life Jalen knew. It wasn't just the phone or the expensive clothes. It was the whole package. The sense that Timmy was insulated from everything that Jalen had fought his whole life to survive. He wasn't a part of this world. Not in the way Jalen was. After a few minutes, the woman and her son reached the street corner. Jalen stood frozen in place, his mind racing. As much as he had wanted to turn and walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening here. He had acted on pure instinct when he saved Timmy, but now there was a weight pressing down on him. That's when Timmy turned and looked back at him. His gaze wasn't full of fear or thanks anymore. It was curious, almost as if he was searching for something deeper, something Jalen didn't understand. There was a long pause before Timmy spoke, his voice small but steady. "Thank you again," he said, his words echoing the same gratitude he had expressed earlier. But there was something else in the way he said it. Something almost rehearsed, as if he had been taught how to react in situations like this. Jalen felt a strange unease bubbling inside him. There was a sharpness to Timmy's eyes, an intelligence that didn't match his age. It was almost like the boy had seen more of the world than he let on. You're welcome," Jalen replied, unsure of how to respond to the boy's stare. There was a brief silence between them, and Jalen could feel the weight of it in his chest. The woman glanced back again, her lips pressing together in a tight smile, and then she motioned for Timmy to hurry. As they disappeared around the corner, Jalen stood there, rooted to the spot. He wasn't sure why he felt so unsettled. But as the last of the sunlight dipped beneath the horizon, Jalen caught a glint of something shiny from Timmy's wrist. The boy had been wearing a watch, a gold watch that was far too extravagant for a child his age, especially one who looked like he'd just wandered out of a place like this. It was polished, gleaming, clearly expensive. Jalen had never seen anything like it on anyone in his neighborhood, let alone a kid who didn't even seem to know how to tie his own shoes properly. "Must be nice," Jalen muttered under his breath. The next day, Jalen's curiosity got the better of him. He couldn't stop thinking about Timmy and his family. He tried to shake it off. He didn't have the time or energy to concern himself with other people's problems. But something kept pulling him back, like an unanswered question gnawing at the back of his mind. So, without really thinking it through, Jalen decided to head down the same street where he had seen Timmy and his mother the day before. As he rounded the corner, he saw the woman again, but this time, she wasn't alone. A man was standing next to her, a tall figure in a sharp suit, his face set in an expression that was both commanding and confident. He was talking to a few people in the distance, all of them in their own business, but as Jalen approached, the man's voice grew clearer. "Do you have the report on the incident yesterday? We need to be sure there are no loose ends," he was saying. Jalen froze. The man's voice, polished, authoritative, sent a chill down his spine. He hadn't noticed before, but now, it was becoming more apparent. These people were far from the ordinary residents of this neighborhood. This wasn't just a random meeting in the street. This was something bigger. Jalen leaned against the nearby brick wall, trying to blend into the shadows, feeling the distance between himself and the life he had known suddenly stretch even further. Something about the man's words, the controlled manner in which he spoke, and the way the woman nodded without protest made Jalen feel like a stranger to everything happening around him. Before he could move, the man's gaze flicked in his direction. For a second, their eyes locked and Jalen's stomach dropped. He quickly turned away, but it was too late. He had been noticed. The man had seen him. After that day, everything started to change for Jalen. The streets he had always walked without a second thought now felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't quite understand. He had done something good, something that was supposed to make him feel proud. He had saved Timmy's life, without asking for anything in return. But as the days went on, the feeling of pride was quickly replaced by an unfamiliar discomfort. At first, it was subtle. It started with whispers behind his back, eyes watching him from street corners, from the doorways of local shops, even from across the street when he was just trying to go about his day. His friends, who had always been his brothers, started treating him differently. They'd pass him by without their usual greeting, or they'd give him a look, a sideways glance that lingered just long enough to make Jalen feel like he had something to prove. He couldn't understand why. What had he done wrong? But it didn't take long for him to realize that his actions hadn't gone unnoticed by everyone in the neighborhood. The local gang, the ones who controlled the block, the ones who ran the hustle, had their own set of rules. And Jalen had unknowingly broken one of those rules. "Yo, Jay, we need to talk," one of the older guys, Marcus, said as Jalen passed by the corner store. Marcus wasn't exactly a leader, but he was close enough. He had his connections and his way of getting things done. When he called you over, you didn't ignore him. Jalen felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Marcus wasn't someone you wanted to mess with, but it was still confusing. He hadn't done anything to warrant this kind of attention, had he? All he had done was save a kid's life. That was it. So why did it feel like he was walking into something much bigger than he realized? "What's up?" Jalen said, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the tension in the air. Marcus stepped a little closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "You really gonna mess with people like that?" Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're special, all because you saved some rich kid?" Jalen blinked, confused. "What are you talking about, man? I didn't do anything wrong. You saved the mayor's kid, Jay. You think that's just gonna go unnoticed?" Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp, his words cutting through Jalen's confusion like a knife. Jalen's stomach dropped. The mayor's kid? So that was it. Timmy wasn't just some random rich kid, he was someone with power. Someone connected to a whole world that Jalen had no part in. It made sense now, the woman's attitude, the polished appearance, the way everything seemed so out of place. But none of that helped Jalen figure out what was happening now. "I didn't know who he was," Jalen said, trying to explain, trying to make it clear that he hadn't done this for any reason other than instinct. "It don't matter, Jay. You put us all at risk, associating with people like that," Marcus said, his voice rising now, drawing the attention of a few others standing around nearby. "You think they care about us down here? They ain't coming back for you. You ain't one of them, no matter how much you try to act like it." Jalen felt a sting in his chest. He knew Marcus was right. The people who had money, real money, had nothing to do with the lives of people like him. They lived in different worlds, with different rules. And in the eyes of the people in his neighborhood, Jalen had crossed a line by saving Timmy. He hadn't been asked to, hadn't been paid for his trouble. And now it was clear, he wasn't just a hero. He was a target. Over the next few days, things got worse. It wasn't just Marcus and his crew. The whispers grew louder. People who had always nodded when Jalen passed by started looking at him like he was someone they didn't recognize. There were rumors spreading that Jalen had become a pawn for the higher-ups, that he was being watched, that he was playing a dangerous game by associating with people who had power. "You think the mayor's gonna do something for you, man? You think that kid is gonna help you out?" His best friend, Malik, asked him one evening as they sat on the curb, the orange streetlight casting long shadows. "You're just some guy to them. You're not one of them." Jalen wanted to argue, to say that he didn't do it for any reward, but Malik's words rang true. He knew the streets. He knew the game. And the game didn't include people like him, no matter how much good he tried to do. It wasn't just the whispers, either. There were eyes on him. Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching. It started small. A few cars that passed too slowly, people standing too close on the corner, a phone call that felt too carefully timed. He couldn't tell who it was, but it felt like the neighborhood was turning on him. Even his own family began to ask questions. His mother, who had always been proud of his ability to think on his feet, started to look at him with doubt in her eyes. His little sister, Tasha, who had always been the sunshine of their small apartment, had stopped asking him to play with her. She was more distant now, like she knew something he didn't. "I saw you talking to that woman the other day, Jalen," his mom said one night as they sat at the kitchen table. "I don't know who she is, but you need to be careful. Those people don't come around here for nothing. You don't want to get tangled up in their business." Jalen couldn't help but feel frustrated. His mother was just trying to protect him. But it felt like everything he did, everything he had ever worked for, was slipping through his fingers. He had tried to do the right thing. He had acted on impulse, on pure instinct, to save a child's life. But now, all he could see was the fallout. His community didn't trust him, the gang didn't trust him, and even his own family was questioning him. That night, as he lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, Jalen's mind was a storm of thoughts. Had he made the right decision? Was helping Timmy worth all of this? The boy had been in danger. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. But now, everything was different. And for the first time in a long time, Jalen wondered if doing the right thing had been the wrong choice after all. The days after saving Timmy were filled with tension, confusion, and a sense of something bigger lurking just out of reach. Jalen had tried to move on, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him was shifting in ways he didn't understand. He had done something good, and yet, everything was falling apart. One morning, just a week after the incident, Jalen was standing at the corner store when a sleek, black SUV pulled up. The engine purred as the car came to a halt in front of him. The tinted windows rolled down, and a woman's voice called out from inside. "Jalen." He froze. The voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He stepped closer, cautiously, and to his surprise, it was Mrs. Jennings, the woman who had been with Timmy the day he saved him. She looked at him with a warm smile, her gaze steady but not without an underlying intensity. "Hey there. Timmy's been asking about you. He wanted to see you again," she said. Jalen blinked. "Timmy? Why?" She smiled again, this time with more intent, almost as if she were inviting him into a world that was far removed from the one he knew. "He's fine. But he's been talking about you a lot. You're a hero in his eyes. We'd like to invite you to our place for a meal. We'd like to thank you for saving him." The invitation hung in the air, and Jalen found himself caught off guard. Why would they want to see him again? It wasn't like he had done anything for them. He hadn't saved Timmy for any reward. But still, the offer lingered, and before he knew it, he found himself agreeing. It wasn't like he had much to lose anyway. That evening, Jalen walked up to a massive, gated mansion. A stark contrast to the cramped apartment buildings he was used to. The gates swung open as he approached, and he was escorted up a long driveway by a well-dressed butler. Everything about the place screamed wealth. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and the sprawling yard looked like something straight out of a luxury magazine. Jalen felt out of place, and with each step he took, he felt smaller and smaller. He didn't belong here, didn't know why he was even invited. As the front door opened, Jalen was met by Mrs. Jennings, who ushered him inside. "Welcome, Jalen. Timmy's been looking forward to this," she said, her tone warm but laced with an odd sense of purpose. Timmy was sitting on a couch in the lavish living room, dressed in clothes that Jalen could never have dreamed of owning. He stood up when Jalen entered, a bright smile lighting up his face. "Jalen, you came?" Timmy said, his voice full of gratitude. Jalen tried to smile back, though it felt forced. "Yeah, I guess I did. You wanted to talk?" Before Timmy could respond, Mrs. Jennings led Jalen over to a large dining table where a few other people were already sitting. A man stood up, tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that Jalen immediately recognized. The man extended his hand. "Good to meet you, Jalen. I'm Mayor Matthews, Timmy's father." Jalen's heart stopped for a moment. His mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. The mayor? Timmy was the mayor's son? The same mayor whose name was splashed across billboards and newspapers, whose face was everywhere in the city, always associated with power, wealth, and status. Timmy, the boy he had saved, was his son? He shook the mayor's hand mechanically, still in shock. "I didn't know," Jalen managed to say, his voice tight. "I didn't know who he was." Mayor Matthews smiled, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with Jalen. "No one expects you to. But I'm glad you helped him, Jalen. You've done something not many people would do, and we're grateful." Jalen stood there, still trying to process the turn of events. He wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, he was standing in the house of one of the most powerful people in the city, surrounded by luxury he could never have imagined. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Why had they invited him here? Was it gratitude, or was there something more to it? Timmy, sensing his unease, stood and walked over to him. "I've been talking about you, Jalen. I told my dad how you saved me, how you didn't hesitate. You're a hero." The words should have made Jalen feel proud, but instead, they weighed him down. He had done what anyone with a heart would have done, but now, in this room full of strangers, the words hero felt hollow. Mayor Matthews continued, his voice smooth and calculated. "We know that people like you often don't get the recognition they deserve, Jalen. So, we'd like to help. You've shown that you're someone of character, and we believe you can go far. We can offer you opportunities, help with schooling, jobs, a way out of the situation you're in." Jalen's mind swirled. Opportunities? He hadn't saved Timmy for anything in return. But now, this family, this powerful family, was offering him something that could change everything. His family's financial struggles, his dream of leaving the neighborhood, of doing something bigger, everything suddenly felt within reach. But there was a catch, wasn't there? There always was. Jalen felt a growing discomfort as he looked at Mayor Matthews and Mrs. Jennings. They were offering him a way out, but at what cost? Would this be the start of a new life, one where he was forever indebted to them? Was this kindness, or was it just another way for them to use him, to have a connection to the streets that they couldn't reach on their own? "Why me?" Jalen asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "I'm just a kid from the block. Why do you care?" The room went silent for a moment. The mayor exchanged a look with his wife before speaking. "Because you're different. You didn't act out of selfishness. You acted out of a sense of duty. And that's something we value, Jalen. We know what it's like to be looked down on, to struggle to get ahead. We've been there too. But now we have power, and we want to help those who have the potential to change their lives, just like you." Jalen's heart raced, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always been taught that you didn't trust people who lived in mansions like this, that the wealthy and powerful only cared about themselves. But these people were different, weren't they? "Take your time to think about it," the mayor added, his voice firm but gentle. "We want to give you an opportunity, Jalen. It's up to you whether you take it." But as Jalen sat there, looking at the mayor and his family, the words echoed in his mind. Is this genuine, or am I just being used? He didn't know what to think anymore. It felt like a dream, but one that was tangled with doubt and suspicion. He had helped a child, a life had been saved, but now, everything felt like it was part of some bigger game he didn't understand. And in the pit of his stomach, Jalen couldn't help but wonder, was he just another pawn in a world he had no business being a part of? In the days following his visit to the mayor's mansion, Jalen felt a growing weight on his shoulders. It wasn't just the sudden shift in his life or the unexpected opportunities that now seemed to hover on the horizon. It wasn't even the suspicion that came with the idea of being helped by people like the mayor and his family. It was the realization that he wasn't just caught between two worlds. He was standing on the edge of something much more complicated. Jalen had always been proud of who he was, proud of where he came from. The streets he walked, the corner store where he bought his snacks, the block that had watched him grow up, they were part of him, part of his identity. He was the kid who didn't take handouts, who worked hard for every little thing he had. He was part of the community, the neighborhood, where loyalty ran deep and nothing came easily. But now, everything was shifting. The offer the mayor's family had extended to him, a future full of possibilities, doors that could open to a life far beyond what he had ever imagined, wasn't as simple as it seemed. On one hand, it was the kind of dream he had longed for, an escape from poverty, an escape from the cycle of struggle he had always known. But on the other hand, it came with strings attached, and those strings were tying him to a world that didn't know him, a world that viewed him not as a person, but as a tool, a pawn in their game. At night, lying in his bed, Jalen found himself staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out who he really was now. The boy who saved Timmy was a hero, sure. But the hero was now entangled in a web of expectations. The community he had grown up in now saw him as something else. A traitor, an outsider, a sellout. His friends, once his closest allies, had pulled away from him. They no longer saw him as one of them, not after the mayor's family had stepped in. The streets, the people who had always been his family, had begun to look at him with distrust, as if he had abandoned them the moment he had crossed the line into a world of wealth and privilege. But the hardest part was the way he began to see himself. Was he still the same person who had walked these streets just a few weeks ago? The same boy who had looked out for his family, for his friends, for his neighborhood? Or had he become something else? Someone who was willing to compromise his values, his identity, just for a taste of something better? The weight of the mayor's offer kept pressing down on him, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt lost. On one side, there was the promise of a better future, education, opportunities, financial security. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. But on the other side, there was the reality of what he would have to leave behind. The people, the culture, the sense of belonging that had shaped him. He wasn't sure if he could live in that mansion, surrounded by people who saw him as a symbol, as an example of what could be achieved if someone from his background pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. The people at the top often spoke like that, as if the struggle of growing up in poverty was something you could just rise above, as if it was a simple matter of willpower. They didn't understand the complexities of living in a world where every decision you made was influenced by the need to survive. They didn't understand the deep-rooted history of struggle, the weight of racial and social inequalities that shaped everything he did. But Jalen also knew that the reality of staying where he wasn't much better. The constant fear of violence, the limited opportunities, the cycle of poverty, he had seen it take too many lives. His friends, his cousins, his neighbors, so many of them had gotten caught up in a system that didn't give them the chance to do anything else. He had been lucky so far. Maybe it wasn't about just saving Timmy, it was about giving himself a chance. A chance to break free from the constraints that had defined his life up until now. But how could he reconcile that with the boy he used to be? The boy who had sworn he would never become like the people who lived behind gates like the mayors? How could he accept an offer like this without losing himself in the process? Jalen found himself alone more and more these days. The friends he used to hang with, the people who had always understood him, started to pull away. He couldn't blame them. They didn't get why he would even consider such an offer. They didn't see the bigger picture, the chance to change everything for his family, for his future. They saw a sellout, someone who had taken the easy way out, someone who had abandoned the block. In his more honest moments, Jalen wondered if they were right. Maybe he had forgotten where he came from. Maybe he was just a naive kid, starstruck by the wealth and promises of a life he had only ever seen from the outside. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this new world. Maybe he didn't deserve it. But even as he struggled with these thoughts, he also knew that part of him was itching to take the opportunity. He was tired of fighting, tired of living in a world where his future was always in question. He had dreams that had always seemed just out of reach. And now, they were suddenly within grasp. But at what cost? It wasn't just about money or success anymore. It was about who he would become in the process. If he took the mayor's help, would he still be Jalen? Would he still be the boy who grew up on these streets, who understood the struggle, who had always fought for what was right? Or would he become something else? Something that no longer belonged to the world he had known. Jalen spent hours walking through the neighborhood, trying to clear his head. He passed by the same places he had walked 1,000 times before. The corner where he had first met Malik, the alley behind the store where he had shared so many laughs with his friends. These places had always felt like home. But now, they seemed distant, as if they belonged to someone else. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something bigger, something he couldn't control. He was torn between the future that the mayor promised him and the life he had always known. Torn between his old self and the new version of himself that was slowly taking shape. But one thing was clear, no matter what decision he made, he couldn't go back. The world had changed, and Jalen had changed with it. The question now wasn't who he used to be, but who he was going to become. In the days following his visit to the mayor's mansion, Jalen felt a growing weight on his shoulders. It wasn't just the sudden shift in his life or the unexpected opportunities that now seemed to hover on the horizon. It wasn't even the suspicion that came with the idea of being helped by people like the mayor and his family. It was the realization that he wasn't just caught between two worlds. He was standing on the edge of something much more complicated. Jalen had always been proud of who he was, proud of where he came from. The streets he walked, the corner store where he bought his snacks, the block that had watched him grow up, they were part of him, part of his identity. He was the kid who didn't take handouts, who worked hard for every little thing he had. He was part of the community, the neighborhood, where loyalty ran deep and nothing came easily. But now, everything was shifting. The offer the mayor's family had extended to him, A future full of possibilities, doors that could open to a life far beyond what he had ever imagined, wasn't as simple as it seemed. On one hand, it was the kind of dream he had longed for, an escape from poverty, an escape from the cycle of struggle he had always known. But on the other hand, it came with strings attached, and those strings were tying him to a world that didn't know him, a world that viewed him not as a person, but as a tool, a pawn in their game. At night, lying in his bed, Jalen found himself staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out who he really was now. The boy who saved Timmy was a hero, sure. But the hero was now entangled in a web of expectations. The community he had grown up in now saw him as something else. A traitor, an outsider, a sellout. His friends, once his closest allies, had pulled away from him. They no longer saw him as one of them, not after the mayor's family had stepped in. The streets, the people who had always been his family, had begun to look at him with distrust, as if he had abandoned them the moment he had crossed the line into a world of wealth and privilege. But the hardest part was the way he began to see himself. Was he still the same person who had walked these streets just a few weeks ago? The same boy who had looked out for his family, for his friends, for his neighborhood? Or had he become something else? Someone who was willing to compromise his values, his identity, just for a taste of something better? The weight of the mayor's offer kept pressing down on him, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt lost. On one side, there was the promise of a better future, education, opportunities, financial security. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. But on the other side, there was the reality of what he would have to leave behind. The people, the culture, the sense of belonging that had shaped him. He wasn't sure if he could live in that mansion, surrounded by people who saw him as a symbol, as an example of what could be achieved if someone from his background pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. The people at the top often spoke like that, as if the struggle of growing up in poverty was something you could just rise above, as if it was a simple matter of willpower. They didn't understand the complexities of living in a world where every decision you made was influenced by the need to survive. They didn't understand the deep-rooted history of struggle, the weight of racial and social inequalities that shaped everything he did. But Jalen also knew that the reality of staying where he was wasn't much better. The constant fear of violence, the limited opportunities, the cycle of poverty, he had seen it take too many lives. His friends, his cousins, his neighbors, so many of them had gotten caught up in a system that didn't give them the chance to do anything else. He had been lucky so far. Maybe it wasn't about just saving Timmy, it was about giving himself a chance. A chance to break free from the constraints that had defined his life up until now. But how could he reconcile that with the boy he used to be? The boy who had sworn he would never become like the people who lived behind gates like the mayors? How could he accept an offer like this without losing himself in the process? Jalen found himself alone more and more these days. The friends he used to hang with, the people who had always understood him, started to pull away. He couldn't blame them. They didn't get why he would even consider such an offer. They didn't see the bigger picture, the chance to change everything for his family, for his future. They saw a sellout, someone who had taken the easy way out, someone who had abandoned the block. In his more honest moments, Jalen wondered if they were right. Maybe he had forgotten where he came from. Maybe he was just a naive kid, starstruck by the wealth and promises of a life he had only ever seen from the outside. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this new world. Maybe he didn't deserve it. But even as he struggled with these thoughts, he also knew that part of him was itching to take the opportunity. He was tired of fighting, tired of living in a world where his future was always in question. He had dreams that had always seemed just out of reach. And now, they were suddenly within grasp. But at what cost? It wasn't just about money or success anymore. It was about who he would become in the process. If he took the mayor's help, would he still be Jalen? Would he still be the boy who grew up on these streets, who understood the struggle, who had always fought for what was right? Or would he become something else? Something that no longer belonged to the world he had known. Jalen spent hours walking through the neighborhood, trying to clear his head. He passed by the same places he had walked 1,000 times before. The corner where he had first met Malik, the alley behind the store where he had shared so many laughs with his friends. These places had always felt like home. But now, they seemed distant. as if they belonged to someone else. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something bigger, something he couldn't control. He was torn between the future that the mayor promised him and the life he had always known. Torn between his old self and the new version of himself that was slowly taking shape. But one thing was clear, no matter what decision he made, he couldn't go back. The world had changed, and Jalen had changed with it. The question now wasn't who he used to be, but who he was going to become. Jalen couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. Every time he stepped into his neighborhood, every glance he caught from his old friends and neighbors, there was a silent judgment hanging in the air. It was as if they were all waiting for him to make a choice that would either elevate him or condemn him. But what if there was no right choice? It had been 2 weeks since his visit to the mayor's mansion, and every day felt like a slow unraveling of everything he thought he knew about the world. The doors the mayor's family had promised him, doors to a better life, were now standing wide open, beckoning him to step through. But each time Jalen even considered it, the weight of his community's distrust crushed him. He could almost feel their eyes on him, see their judgment in every passing glance. "Man, you've changed," Malik had said when they ran into each other on the street the other day. Malik was one of his closest friends, someone who understood what it was like to struggle, to fight for every inch. Jalen had always been able to count on Malik for a dose of reality when his head got too full of dreams. But this time, there was no understanding in Malik's tone, only suspicion. "What do you mean?" Jalen had asked, his voice defensive. "I mean, you're acting like you're better than us now," Malik had replied, his eyes narrowing. "Hanging out with those rich folks. You're just another one of them now, aren't you? Just a sellout?" Jalen had tried to explain, to make him understand. But the words got stuck in his throat. He didn't know how to explain what was going on in his head, the tension between what he wanted and what his community expected of him. To Malik and to many others in the neighborhood, accepting help from the mayor's family meant abandoning everything they had fought for. It was a betrayal of their collective struggle, a betrayal of the very people who had always had his back. Jalen walked away that day feeling like a stranger in his own skin. But it wasn't just his friends who were judging him. It was the whole system, the structures of power that kept people like him in their place. Every time Jalen thought about the mayor's family and the world they represented, he felt a tightening in his chest. The wealthy, the powerful, they didn't see him as a person. They saw him as an object, a symbol, a success story they could point to and say, "Look, this is how we help people. This is how you can rise above your circumstances." But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just a matter of hard work and determination. It was about a system that was rigged from the start, a system that stacked the odds against people like Jalen from the moment they were born. At first, Jalen had been flattered by the mayor's attention. The promises of scholarships, mentorship, and career opportunities had seemed like a golden ticket. But the more he thought about it, the more he began to question why they were offering him help in the first place. Was it because they genuinely cared about him, or was he just a pawn in their game? A token of their supposed benevolence? And there was the uncomfortable truth he couldn't escape. The fact that his very existence, his very presence in their world, was an anomaly. The mayor's family had shown up, extending their hand to him as if they were doing him a favor, but they had no idea what it meant to be black and poor. They had no idea what it was like to live with the constant threat of violence, the never-ending struggle to survive. They didn't understand the weight of history, the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the systemic oppression that had kept people like him from ever having a real shot at success. Jalen could feel the weight of all of this pressing down on him as he walked through the streets. He had always known the world was unfair, but now he was starting to understand just how deep the divide went. It wasn't just about class. It was about race. And race was something that couldn't be ignored, no matter how much he wished it could be. When he thought about his old neighborhood, the people he had grown up with, it made him angry. They weren't just struggling because of bad choices or lack of effort. They were struggling because of a system that had systematically oppressed them for generations. A system that made sure that no matter how hard they worked, they would always be kept down. Jalen had seen it in the faces of the men who sat on the corners, the women who worked multiple jobs just to feed their kids, the young people who were stuck in dead-end jobs with no real future. They were all trapped, and no matter how hard they tried to break free, the system always found a way to pull them back. And then there were the rich families like the mayors, the people who could snap their fingers and change their entire lives. They had the money, the connections, the power to make things happen. They lived in mansions behind high gates, in communities where crime was just a statistic, where education was a privilege, not a struggle. They had never known the fear of being judged just because of the color of their skin. They had never been held back by the invisible hand of racism that kept black and brown people from achieving the same things as their white counterparts. Jalen wasn't sure if he could ever be part of that world, even if he wanted to. It felt like a world where he would always be an outsider, a world that only saw his potential in terms of what he could offer them, not who he was. But the deeper truth was that the system had already made up its mind about people like him. He could work hard, he could strive for success, but in the end, he would always be a product of his circumstances. No matter how much he achieved, the color of his skin would always be the first thing people saw. He spent late nights reading about the history of systemic racism, about the ways the education system, the criminal justice system, and the job market all worked against people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, particularly people of color. The more he read, the more the pieces of his life started to fall into place. He realized that he wasn't just fighting for a better life for himself. He was fighting against a system that had been designed to keep him, and others like him, at the bottom. Jalen wasn't sure what the answer was anymore. He didn't know if he could accept the mayor's offer and live in their world without losing who he was. He didn't know if he could keep walking through the streets with the same pride and sense of self that had defined him for so long. He didn't know if he could bridge the gap between the two worlds, the world of privilege and the world of struggle. But one thing he did know, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He couldn't pretend that everything was just about hard work and determination. The deck was stacked, and it wasn't just his work ethic that would determine his future, it was the color of his skin, the zip code he was born into, and the system that had already decided his fate before he even had a chance to play the game. As Jalen stood on the edge of his old neighborhood, looking out over the familiar streets, he realized that the fight wasn't just about escaping, it was about understanding the fight. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward changing the rules of the game. The weight of the decision hung heavily on Jalen as he sat alone in his room that evening, the city lights casting long shadows on the walls. His thoughts swirled around him like a storm. What was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to accept the mayor's help and step into a new world, a world of privilege, opportunities, and a life far removed from everything he had known? Or was he supposed to stay true to his roots, to the community that had raised him, and reject the offer that, deep down, felt like a betrayal? Jalen knew that either choice would come with its own consequences. If he rejected the mayor's offer, he would remain in the same place, facing the same struggles, the same challenges. His friends would likely stand by him, but what about his family? Could he really help them if he stayed in the same circumstances? And what about his own future? Was he willing to sacrifice his potential, his dreams, for the sake of loyalty to a world that had never been kind to him? But if he accepted the mayor's offer, he would enter a world where he was seen not as Jalen, the person, but as Jalen, the success story. A token of what could be achieved if you worked hard enough. He would be another black kid from the hood who had made it, but he would also lose a part of himself, his connection to the streets, to the people who had always been his family. He would no longer belong to the world he had fought for. And there was a part of him that feared he might forget where he came from, that he might lose sight of the very things that made him who he was. It had been a long journey to get here. From the moment he had saved Timmy, Jalen had been on a path he had never expected to walk. The world around him had shifted, pulling him in different directions, forcing him to confront his own beliefs, his values, and his place in a system that seemed stacked against him. He had faced his own internal battles, questioning his worth, his place in the world, and whether or not he was worthy of the opportunities now being offered to him. But in the end, Jalen knew the answer. The phone buzzed on his nightstand. It was a message from Timmy. The mayor's son had been quiet for a few days since their last conversation, and Jalen had been wondering how the boy was processing everything. They had met several times after the day Jalen saved him, but the truth was that Timmy hadn't fully understood the complexity of Jalen's decision. To him, Jalen was a hero, and heroes were supposed to take the help they were offered. But Timmy didn't understand the layers of history, of race and class, that shaped Jalen's world. He didn't understand how difficult it was to reconcile the offer of a better future with the fear of losing everything that made you who you were. The message was short, but it was all Timmy needed to say. Jalen, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about us. I get it now. I don't know if I could ever fully understand, but I respect your decision, whatever it is. You've taught me more than anyone ever could. Thank you. Reading those words, Jalen felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't just saving Timmy anymore. He was teaching him something far more important, something that had taken him a long time to learn himself. Timmy was learning that courage didn't just come from accepting help or taking the easy way out. True courage came from facing difficult choices, from standing up for what you believed in, even when it meant sacrificing something for the greater good. Jalen set the phone down and stood up, his hands shaking slightly. It was time. He walked out of his room and into the living room, where his mother was sitting on the couch, watching TV. She looked up as he entered, sensing the change in the air. She had always been his rock, the one person who never asked for anything in return, who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Jalen could see the worry in her eyes, the unspoken question of what he was going to do. She knew how much this decision meant to him. "Mom, I've made my choice," Jalen said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She didn't ask what the choice was. She didn't need to. She knew him better than anyone else. "I'm going to turn down the mayor's offer," Jalen continued. "I'm not ready to leave all of this behind. I can't forget where I came from, and I can't forget the people who helped me get here. I have to stay true to them. I have to stay true to myself." His mother looked at him for a long moment, and then, without a word, she reached out and pulled him into a tight embrace. Jalen held her, feeling the warmth of her love, the unconditional support that had always been there for him. No matter what happened, no matter what path he chose, his mother would always be his foundation. "Are you sure, baby?" she asked softly. Jalen nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, I'm sure." The decision wasn't easy. It wasn't the path that promised the most success, the most security, or the most comfort. But it was the path that would keep him grounded. It was the path that would allow him to remain connected to the people who mattered most. The people who had always been there for him, the people who had shaped him into who he was. As Jalen walked out the door, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't running away from the future. He was choosing to face it on his own terms. He knew there would be struggles ahead, that his decision wouldn't be understood by everyone, but he also knew that he would never regret it. He would keep fighting for the change he wanted to see, not just for himself, but for his community, for people who looked like him. The mayor's son, Timmy, had been watching from the sidelines. He hadn't fully understood Jalen's decision at first, but now he did. As Jalen turned down the offer, Timmy realized something important. True courage wasn't just about accepting help or climbing the ladder of success. It was about staying true to your roots, your values, and your identity, no matter the cost. Jalen had shown him what it meant to have integrity, to have the courage to make the difficult choices even when they didn't lead to fame or fortune. And for the first time, Timmy understood the power of humility and the weight of privilege. As Jalen walked down the street, he wasn't just walking away from the offer of a better life. He was walking toward something even greater. He was walking toward a future where he could make a difference, not just for himself, but for the people who needed him the most. He had made his choice, and with it, he had become something more than just a hero. He had become a symbol of what true courage, true growth, and true strength really meant. Jalen had been walking down the familiar streets of his neighborhood, trying to clear his head after making his decision. The tension between staying true to his roots and turning down the mayor's offer still weighed heavily on him. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence, and every now and then, he caught sight of the people who lived in the same world he had always known. They looked the same, no better, no worse, but he felt different. The choice he had made had changed him. It had set him apart from them, in ways he wasn't sure how to explain. As he passed the corner store, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Timmy. He had been expecting this. After all, it had been a few days since Jalen had made his decision to turn down the mayor's help. He figured Timmy would want to know what had happened, or maybe express his thoughts on Jalen's choice. But the message was different this time. There was an urgency to it. "Jalen, I need to talk to you. Can we meet? I need to tell you something." Jalen frowned. There was something in the message that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't like Timmy to ask for a serious conversation like this. The boy had always seemed a bit more carefree, a little too wrapped up in his world to fully understand Jalen's. But something in his tone told Jalen this was important. He quickly typed back, "Sure. Where?" The response came almost instantly, "Meet me at the park. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Jalen didn't waste any time. He headed straight to the park, a small patch of green in the middle of the city, where he and Timmy had spent some of their more casual moments. It was a far cry from the sprawling lawns of the mayor's mansion, but it was their place, neutral ground, where they had shared conversations that were often about nothing, but somehow always meant everything. As he approached the park, Jalen spotted Timmy sitting on the bench, looking more serious than he had ever seen him. The boy was dressed casually, in a hoodie and jeans, but there was a tension in his posture. His shoulders were hunched, and his eyes didn't have the same spark of confidence they usually did. Something was off. "Yo, Timmy," Jalen greeted, approaching the bench slowly. Timmy looked up at him, his face pale. "Hey, Jalen," he replied quietly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar weight. "I need to tell you something." Jalen sat beside him, folding his arms. "You're starting to worry me, man. What's going on?" Timmy took a deep breath, as if trying to steady himself before speaking. "It's about everything I said before, about the offer, about all of it." He hesitated, his eyes flitting nervously around the park. "I don't think you understand the whole story. I don't think you really know me." Jalen frowned, feeling a sense of unease settle over him. He had always thought of Timmy as just the privileged kid from the mayor's family, someone who didn't have to deal with the struggles that people like him did. But now, seeing the boy's discomfort, he wondered if he had misjudged him entirely. "I don't know what you mean, Timmy. You're the mayor's son, man. You've got everything. You've never had to fight for anything. What could there be that you're hiding?" Jalen's words were blunt, but they came from a place of confusion and frustration. It was hard for him to imagine that Timmy's life had been anything but easy. Timmy shook his head, his eyes darkening with emotion. "You don't get it. You don't know what it's like to live in my world. You see the mansion, you see the cars and the clothes, and you think everything's perfect. But you don't see the pressure. You don't see the expectations. You don't see the stuff I have to deal with behind closed doors." Jalen was silent for a moment, trying to understand. He had never thought about what Timmy's life might be like beyond the surface. He had always seen him as the rich kid, the one with all the advantages. But now, as Timmy spoke, Jalen realized how little he actually knew about him. "What do you mean, pressure?" Jalen asked quietly, his tone softer now, as if he was starting to hear Timmy for the first time. Timmy looked down at his hands, fingers twisting nervously. "My dad, he's not who you think he is. He's not the person he pretends to be. He's got secrets. And sometimes, I think he hates me for being who I am. He's always comparing me to his image of the perfect son, someone who's perfect in every way, someone who will carry on the family name. And I'm not that person." Jalen's heart tightened at Timmy's words. He had never imagined that someone like Timmy could feel the weight of expectations in such a crushing way. He had always seen him as the beneficiary of privilege, not someone who was suffering under the weight of it. "My mom's sick," Timmy continued, his voice wavering. "She's been in and out of the hospital for the past year. My dad's been so busy with his career, he hasn't been around much. I'm the one who has to take care of her, but he doesn't even notice. All he sees is his perfect little image, and I can never measure up to it. I can never be the son he wants me to be." Jalen sat in stunned silence, absorbing everything Timmy had just shared. The boy wasn't just the privileged son of a powerful man. He was a young person caught between two worlds, struggling to meet expectations that were impossible to fulfill. The pressure of living up to his father's ideal had weighed heavily on him, and the secrecy surrounding his family's problems had made him feel more alone than anyone could have imagined. "Timmy," Jalen said slowly, his voice filled with a mixture of empathy and understanding. "I had no idea. I didn't know." Timmy finally looked up, meeting Jalen's gaze. There was something in his eyes now, vulnerability, a glimpse of the person he had been hiding behind the polished facade. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to see me as weak, especially not you. You're the one who saved me, the one who made me realize there's more to life than money and status." Jalen nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Timmy's confession. "We all have our battles, man. It's not always what it seems on the outside." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jalen had always thought of Timmy as the kid with all the answers, the one who didn't have to struggle. But now, he realized that they were both struggling in their own ways. They were both fighting against expectations, Timmy against the pressure of his family, and Jalen against the limitations imposed on him by society. For the first time, Jalen felt a true connection with Timmy, not as a hero and a benefactor, but as two people who had faced different kinds of challenges, who understood the weight of living in a world that demanded so much from them. They were both trying to figure out who they were, in a world that was constantly trying to define them. "I'm sorry," Timmy said quietly. "I know I probably seem like I've got it all figured out, but I don't. I don't know what I'm doing half the time." Jalen smiled softly, shaking his head. "It's all right, man. We're all just trying to make it through, right?" Timmy nodded, a small, genuine smile crossing his face for the first time in what felt like a long while. "Yeah. Thanks for hearing me out, Jalen." Jalen clapped him on the back, a gesture of solidarity. "Anytime, bro, anytime." The late afternoon sun bathed the city in gold as Marcus sat on the porch of his new home, a modest but comfortable house provided by the mayor's gratitude. It had been months since the fateful day when he saved Ethan from a runaway car. His life, once defined by struggle, had transformed dramatically, but not without its share of challenges. Marcus looked out at the bustling street, now a far cry from the rundown alleyways he had grown up in. His new life came with privileges he had never dared to dream of: a scholarship to a prestigious school, the chance to work with mentors who saw his potential, and a place at the mayor's table, both literally and figuratively. Yet the whispers of his old neighborhood echoed in his mind. "Sold out," some of his old friends said. "Just another kid who got lucky and forgot where he came from." Marcus had heard these accusations on social media and even in passing conversations when he returned to visit his old neighborhood. People resented the attention he now received, especially from the mayor, whose policies many in the community distrusted. But Marcus knew the truth. He hadn't forgotten where he came from. He volunteered at local youth centers, tutoring kids who reminded him of himself not too long ago. He donated part of his scholarship stipend to community projects and still hung out with a few close friends from the neighborhood. "What they don't see," Marcus muttered to himself, "is how hard it is to balance all of this." The city's opinion was polarized. On one hand, Marcus had become a symbol of hope. Local news outlets praised him as a teen hero who defied the odds. He was invited to events and even gave speeches about courage and perseverance. He felt proud knowing that his actions inspired other kids to believe in themselves. But there were those who saw him differently. "Just a publicity stunt," some critics wrote in the papers. "The mayor's using that boy to improve his image." The mayor's intentions had initially seemed self-serving, but Marcus had grown to understand the man better. Behind the politician's polished exterior was a father who had been genuinely shaken by the near loss of his son. Ethan, the mayor's son, had also undergone a profound transformation. Once a pampered and somewhat entitled child, he had learned humility through his bond with Marcus. "Why didn't you let go of me that day?" Ethan asked one evening as they played basketball in the driveway. "You could have gotten hurt?" "Because I couldn't let you die," Marcus said simply. "Every life matters, Ethan. Yours included." Ethan had never considered life from Marcus's perspective before. Spending time with him opened his eyes to struggles he'd been oblivious to: poverty, systemic racism, and the resilience it took to survive in such conditions. Under Marcus's influence, Ethan began to stand up for what was right, even in his own home. At a family dinner, he once called out a relative for making a racially insensitive comment, something he might never have done before meeting Marcus. "It's not just about what's easy," Ethan had said, echoing Marcus's words. "It's about what's right." The mayor's reflection. The mayor, too, had been deeply changed by the events. At first, his decision to help Marcus had been driven by gratitude and public relations. But over time, he came to admire the teen's integrity and determination. "You've taught me more about leadership than any campaign ever could," the mayor confessed one evening during a private dinner. "Me? Teach you?" Marcus laughed, incredulous. "Yes, you," the mayor said firmly. "You've shown me what it means to serve people, not just for their votes, but because it's the right thing to do." The mayor began advocating for policies that addressed systemic inequality, inspired by his conversations with Marcus. Affordable housing projects, increased funding for education in underserved areas, and mentorship programs for at-risk youth became the centerpiece of his administration's agenda. As the sun set, Marcus thought about the weight of his journey. He wasn't the same scared, hungry kid he had been. He had faced danger, made a life-saving decision, and in doing so, had changed the trajectory of not only his life but the lives of those around him. Still, he missed parts of his old life: the raw authenticity of his neighborhood, the unfiltered laughter with friends, the sense of belonging he sometimes felt he had lost. But he also knew he couldn't go back to being the person he was. The emotional payoff. That evening, the mayor, Ethan, and Marcus sat together in the living room, watching a news segment about a new scholarship program the mayor had introduced, inspired by Marcus's story. The anchor called it a step toward bridging divides in the city. Ethan turned to Marcus and said, "You're not just my hero, you're this city's hero." Marcus smiled, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "Maybe," he said, "but all I really did was save a kid who needed help. The rest, it's just what happens when people choose to care." The story ended not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with a quiet moment of connection. Three people from different worlds, bound together by a single act of courage that had changed them all forever. The evening air was calm, filled with the hum of crickets as Marcus walked through the park where it had all begun. It was the same path where he had first seen Ethan, a scared little boy, frozen in fear as danger hurtled toward him. The memory of that day lingered vividly, but now, it felt different. Back then, Marcus had only thought about saving a life. Now, he understood how much more had been at stake. He paused by the bench where he had sat with Ethan after pulling him to safety, their breaths ragged but alive. Marcus ran his fingers along the worn wood, his mind replaying the moment. Back then, he hadn't known who the boy was, hadn't cared really. All he'd seen was someone in need of help. It was that simple. But the world, Marcus had learned, was rarely so straightforward. As he sat down, his mind wandered to the days that followed. The attention, the scrutiny, the opportunities, it had all come so fast. The mayor had called him a hero, but not everyone had been so quick to celebrate. "They only care because you saved his rich son," one of his old friends had said bitterly. If it was anyone else, no one would have noticed. At the time, Marcus didn't know how to respond. Was it true? Had his actions only mattered because of Ethan's privileged status? The question haunted him for weeks, even as doors opened that had once seemed forever closed. He struggled with guilt, feeling like he had left his old life behind, even though he had always planned to bring those lessons with him. Marcus's reflection deepened as he thought about the bigger picture. His life, Ethan's life, the mayor's, their paths had crossed in a way no one could have predicted. And yet, their differences still loomed large. The injustice of it all wasn't lost on him. He had grown up in a world where people ignored kids like him, where no one would have stopped to notice if he had been the one in danger. But saving Ethan had forced people to see him, and in doing so, it had made them confront their own prejudices. Marcus often thought about the irony of it. Why did someone have to risk their life to be valued? Why did society draw lines between people based on their skin color or their bank account? These were questions he didn't have answers to, but he knew they mattered. Despite the doubts and the struggles, Marcus couldn't deny that something beautiful had come from it all. Ethan had changed. The boy who had once been sheltered by wealth and privilege now saw the world through new eyes. He had started speaking up, challenging the status quo in ways Marcus admired. "People listen to you because of who you are," Marcus had once told Ethan. "Use that voice to make things better." And Ethan had. He had stood by Marcus when others doubted him, defending him even when it meant arguing with his own family. The boy's transformation reminded Marcus that change was possible, even in places where it seemed least likely. The bond Marcus shared with Ethan extended to the mayor as well. At first, Marcus had been wary of the man. He had seen politicians come and go, promising to help only to disappear once the cameras were off. But over time, the mayor had proven himself different. Marcus remembered the day they sat together at a community meeting, surrounded by people from his old neighborhood. The mayor had listened, not just for show, but with genuine interest. He had taken notes, asked questions, and followed up with action. Marcus hadn't expected to feel respect for him, but he did. Sitting on the bench now, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He thought about how much he had grown since that day in the park. Back then, he had been a kid surviving one day at a time, his dreams buried beneath the weight of reality. Now, he was someone who could look ahead, who believed in the possibility of a brighter future, not just for himself, but for others like him. As the sky darkened, Marcus closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him. He thought about the courage it had taken to act that day and the ripple effect it had caused. It wasn't just about saving Ethan, it was about everything that came after, the growth, the challenges, and the lessons that would stay with him forever. When Marcus stood up to leave, he glanced back at the bench one last time. It wasn't just a memory now, it was a reminder of who he was and who he wanted to be. True heroism, he realized, wasn't about grand gestures or recognition. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. Marcus walked away, his steps lighter than they had been in a long time. The city lights twinkled in the distance as Marcus stepped onto the stage at a community event, his heart racing. The mayor had insisted he speak, but Marcus wasn't sure he was ready. He looked out at the crowd, a mix of faces, some familiar, some strangers. Among them were Ethan and the mayor, sitting front and center, their expressions filled with pride. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I'm just someone who acted when it mattered." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. That day, when I saw Ethan in danger, I didn't think about who he was or what it might mean for me. I just knew I couldn't stand by and do nothing. And I think that's what we all need to remember. It's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about showing up for each other when it counts. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. He glanced at Ethan, who smiled encouragingly. "I've learned a lot since that day," Marcus continued. "I've learned that courage doesn't always look like pulling someone out of harm's way. Sometimes, it's standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Sometimes, it's believing in people, even when the world tells you not to." He scanned the crowd, his eyes lingering on the faces of young kids who reminded him of his younger self, hungry for hope, desperate for a reason to believe. "This city has a lot of problems," Marcus admitted. "But we also have the power to change things. It starts with small actions. Kindness, empathy, stepping up when we see someone in need. That's how we make a difference. That's how we make this place better." The audience erupted in applause, but Marcus wasn't done yet. "There's one more thing I want to say," he added, his voice firm. "None of us get through this life alone. I didn't. I had people who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And now, I want to be that person for someone else. So, let's not wait for the perfect moment to help someone. Let's be the reason someone believes in a better future." As Marcus stepped off the stage, the mayor reached out to shake his hand. "You're a natural, Marcus," he said, his tone warm. Marcus smiled but shook his head. "I just spoke the truth." Ethan ran up, his excitement palpable. "That was amazing," he exclaimed. "You're going to inspire so many people." Marcus looked at him, the boy who had once been a stranger but now felt like family. "Maybe," he said with a grin. "But I'm just trying to live by what I said. It's not about me, it's about all of us." That night, as Marcus walked home, he thought about how far he had come. His journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught him the value of resilience, the power of connection, and the importance of standing up for what mattered. Before heading inside, Marcus looked up at the stars. He thought about his mom, who had always told him that even the darkest nights held a light if you looked for it. She was right, he thought. And now, it was his turn to be that light for someone else. The story ended not with grand fanfare, but with a quiet, profound truth. One act of kindness could change everything. Marcus's life was proof of that, and so was Ethan's. It was a reminder to everyone who heard his story that no matter who you were or where you came from, you had the power to make a difference. All it took was the courage to act. As Marcus's story shows, even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that change lives forever. Now it's your turn. Start where you are. Look around. Someone might need your help or support today. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Even a small gesture can make a big impact. Stand up for what's right. Don't wait for the perfect moment to make a difference. Speak up, show empathy, and take action, even when it's uncomfortable. Be the change. Whether it's in your community, at work, or with friends and family, you have the power to inspire change by leading with compassion. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs encouragement or a reminder that heroes come from all walks of life. Let's keep the message alive. Kindness, courage, and empathy can truly transform the world. Join the conversation in the comments below. Tell us about a moment when someone's kindness impacted your life, or how you plan to pay it forward. Let's inspire each other to create a better future, one small step at a time. And remember, the next story of courage could be yours. Glowing star.